Within its old stone walls, the Vatican had long been a place of rigid regulations and hallowed traditions that regulated every aspect of daily life. The rhythm of the centuries, old ceremonial was followed by every gesture, every whisper, and every shadow that passed. In those last days, as Pope Francis lay in his small room, breathing more slowly and dreaming more deeply, the silence was different from the ordered quiet of ritual or prayer. It was the kind of silence that settles before a final farewell, the kind that presses against the skin and lingers between heartbeats, seeming to mourn even before a life has ended. Silence was more than just the absence of sound. It was a language all its own, carrying weight heavier than marble. His once steady fingers trembled with an unmistakable weakness as he sketched the sign of the cross, and his once piercing, acute stare softened into something more contemplative, frequently traveling toward the gardens outside his window. The physicians took care of everything they could, and the Daughters of Charity sisters surrounded him with the gentle efficiency of those who loved without obligation and were yet with the quiet perseverance of a man who had carried many burdens, but still held a place in his heart for one last act of love. Francis's body weakened, but he was not afraid of death because he had spent a lifetime preparing for it. Sister Cecilia, who had been his faithful caregiver for years, heard the request, leaned in to adjust his pillow, her heart aching at the way he struggled to find comfort, and then, with a breath so soft it was almost missed, he said, "Bring him." She hesitated, assuming he was requesting a cardinal, a priest, or a close friend. "Who, Your Holiness?" she asked, her voice steady and his lips parted in a smile. He whispered, "Tell them to let him in," so that he would know for a moment that she had misheard a dog inside the apostolic palace. The Vatican fortress of order and protocol was not a place where animals roamed free outside of the gardens. Tradition was clear. The dying pope's last moments were to be surrounded by prayer and sacrament by dignitaries, anticipating the death of the Vicar of Christ. She saw in his eyes the unwavering certainty, the need that was not born of ceremony, but of something far deeper, love. The kind of love that doesn't ask permission, the kind that breaks down walls built by centuries of hierarchy and pride, the kind that bends the knee without hesitation, out of devotion rather than duty. But there was no place in the meticulously planned rituals for a dusty, limping dog who had never worn a collar, whose lineage was and whose loyalty had never needed documentation. Sister Cecilia exited the chamber, walking swiftly yet respectfully down the stone hallways with her plain shoes rustling the old floors. A young, enthusiastic seminarian was sent dashing to the gardens. When the guards heard the odd request, they looked at each other unsurely but remained silent. They knew without words that this moment required more than following protocol. It required humanity. Outside, the gardens were ablaze with the breath of early spring. The olive trees rustled in a light breeze, their leaves glistening like tiny mirrors, catching the last of the sun's rays as Esteban curled beneath one of them. The Swiss guards, stoic and silent, did not move to block his way. Instead, they stepped aside as if the ancient walls themselves understood that something sacred was happening. Esteban patted inside his claws, clicking softly against the marble floor with each step, a silent testament to the bond that defied every expectation. Such a tree lifted his head, sniffed the air alert, and, without a voice calling him, he rose, his gaits stiff from years spent walking the gardens. He trotted through the grass past the old fountains, finding new strength. According to many who saw it afterward, it seemed as though love itself had found legs and was strolling down the ancient halls as the echo of his paws moved along them like a prayer made of flesh and bone. Not the love of power or pomp, but the sort that didn't require translation, the sort that everyone who had ever loved and lost someone, who had ever stayed when it would have been easier to leave, could relate to. Esteban proceeded to the room where the Pope was lying, pausing only once at the doorway. As if to honor the holiness of what he was about to enter, he crossed into the dim light with a steady breath. Sister Cecilia stood aside, tears threatening her composure, but she knew deep down that this moment was unlike any other. The Holy Father turned his head slowly toward the door, his eyes clouded but bright with recognition, and a warm smile that only true friends can have spread across his face. Esteban moved to the side of the bed, lowered himself gently to the floor, and rested his head against the base of the frame. He didn't jump, whine, or demand attention. Instead, he was there, faithful as he had always been. With what strength was left in him, he reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the rough fur that lingering over the scars that told a story of survival and steadfastness. He said in a barely audible whisper, "There you are," with a weight that could have brought down an empire. Esteban did not move. He required no orders or guarantees. His presence was the answer to a prayer that no one else had heard at that very moment. The centuries-old Vatican customs vanished. The bells of St. Peter's told the hour within, but titles, robes, ceremonies, and all of that didn't matter. What mattered was that a man getting ready to meet his Creator wasn't alone, and that love in its purest, rawest form had transcended all expectations and barriers. Pope Francis closed his eyes, his hands still resting on Esteban's fur. Not resignation filled the room, but peace. The peace that transcends all understanding and that only comes when love has been given and received in its purest form. And so began a story about the kind of quiet, unbreakable bond that can move even the most powerful and ancient institution to silence. This story would echo not only through the marble halls of the Vatican, but also through the hearts of millions of people worldwide, reminding us all what matters most when everything else fails. It started with a simple request that went against protocol, a request that was fundamentally a final living sermon: wealth that will last a lifetime. In a city covered in centuries of magnificence, where even the stones seemed to murmur the names of kings and saints, he wasn't meant to matter. Esteban was not visible. He was simply another stray with no family, no owner, and nowhere to call home. Similar to how so many souls had been pushed aside over the millennia, a creature was forced to the periphery of the eternal metropolis. Rome has always had its share of lost souls and wanderers who slipped between the cracks of grandeur and poverty, but very few had ever wandered as far as the edges of the Vatican gardens, the sacred heart of a kingdom within a kingdom. Esteban was a scrappy thing, and his ribs were thin and sharp under a coat that was covered in dust and neglect. His gait was uneven, and his limp revealed some long-forgotten injury that might have been caused by a car accident, a kick, or just too many nights without shelter. His ears twitched at every sound, half fearful, half hope. He had learned the hard way not to trust people easily, and he was rarely noticed. Those who did typically brushed him off with a stern remark or a palm flick. A bother, where others saw a nuisance. One man saw life without significance. Something completely different. Pope Francis first saw Esteban during one of his early morning walks, those precious moments before the weight of leadership fell. At the time, Pope Francis was known for avoiding the heavy responsibilities of office whenever possible. He had developed the habit of sneaking away into the gardens to find solitude among the roses and olive trees. This was his way of reminding himself that before he was the Holy Father, he was just H, a man formed not by thrones, but by streets and prayers. That morning, as the mist still clung to the garden paths, and the sun painted the sky in tentative, gentle strokes, he was reminded of his past. Francis initially believed it was a trick of the light when he noticed movement near one of the older fountains, but then from behind a bush, a pair of wide, terrified eyes stared back at him, raw, uncertain, and pleading in a way that cut through the facade of titles and ritual. Instead of calling for a guard or ordering the dog removed, he did what he had done so many times before for the world's forgotten. He knelt slowly and painfully, lowering himself onto the cold stones, making himself small and unimportant. The dog did not approach. Instead, he just stared, frozen between fear and hope. Francis said nothing at first, just waited, and then, with a voice barely audible above a breath, he whispered, "You have not been forgotten." This was a menacing gesture, not one of command, but one of invitation. He left a small piece of bread on the ground as a simple sacrifice, and got up to continue walking. When he looked back, Stabino was still standing there, motionless, but something invisible had changed. A bridge had been built, not of iron or stone, but of quiet trust. And Francis returned the following morning. So did Esteban. And so it went on day after day, a ritual of silent recognition of slow, patient love, without grand gestures, taming or ownership, just a steady presence. Over time, the fear in Esteban's eyes subsided, and he gained the courage to take the bread and eventually sit at a distance, watching, waiting for his belonging. Francis named him Esteban, which is a blessing and a prophecy, because there was something almost liturgical about the way Pope Francis treated the dog, as if in caring for Espen he was enacting a living sermon about mercy that words could never fully capture. At first, few people noticed, but those who tended the gardens inside the Vatican walls started leaving small bowls of water under the trees. One seminarian once saw the Pope sitting on a weathered bench, with Espenon curled up at his feet like an anchor. The guards knew, of course, but they dared not intervene. Espen was more than just a dog. He was a living example of the truth he had repeatedly preached from pulpits and balconies, that every life counts, that God's love is not divided between the crowned and the broken, the named and the nameless, and that sometimes the face of Christ is not seen in painted frescoes or golden icons, but rather in the eyes of a shivering animal pleading for trust in a society fixated on spectacle and status. Some in the Vatican disapproved of the Muse's position in the Church, but Esteban stood as a silent rebuke who didn't act or impress. Instead, he just stayed and preached a message that was older than any written text. It was unseemly, they whispered, and it made it difficult to distinguish between the sacred and the profane. But Francis, the shepherd, more than the prince, ignored them because he was aware that God had always used the weaker things in the world to bring the powerful to their knees. Perhaps this knowledge is what made Esteban's presence so appropriate in this pope's life. Jorge in Esban, Mario Bergoglio saw not only a creature in need, but also a reflection of all the forgotten, unloved, and unseen children of God who wait at the edges of the world for someone to notice, someone to kneel. As weeks turned into months, Mario Bergoglio had spent his childhood among the impoverished of Buenos Aires, feeling the pulse of a world that was both blessed and bruised in equal measure. He knew the smell of sweat and toil better than the scent of incense. Esteban's limp became less noticeable. His coat became broader, and his eyes stopped darting at every sound in his straightforward, unwavering manner. He had discovered his home not through material belongings, but through freely offered and received affection, which he requested. He gave everything he had, and as a result, he became one of the Pope's best teachers and performed one of the most surprising miracles at the Vatican. A testament recorded in the peaceful places where genuine religion exists, love without conditions, charity without measure, rather than in marble or sealed by papal decision. In a world obsessed with dominance, achievement, and control, Pope Francis's relationship with Esteban offered something almost revolutionary, a love rooted not in command, but in presence. It wasn't a bond forged through force or expectation. It wasn't about training obedience or ownership. It was about showing up, day after day, without conditions, without demands. It started quietly. The stray who had once limped unseen through Rome's forgotten alleys had found a home not in a grand palace, but in the heart of a man who understood what it meant to be overlooked and loved anyway. Francis never made an effort to do anything more with Esteban than what he was doing for a living, being deserving of dignity. He never scolded him, never called for a leash, never tried to shape the scruffy stray into an image more palatable for Vatican protocol. Instead, he simply made space for Esteban to be himself, wounded, slow to trust, but infinitely capable of love once given the chance. And it was in this simple daily act, this meeting of souls, with no words, no titles, no expectations, that the real gospel was lived out. Theologians could spend lifetimes debating the nature of God's love. Scholars could fill libraries trying to explain agape, the unconditional love so central to the Christian faith. But here beneath the olive trees it was incarnated in flesh and fur, and trembling steps toward trust. Francis would sit for hours on a simple bench, sometimes praying with rosary beads slipping through his fingers, sometimes lost in thought, sometimes just watching the leaves flutter overhead, and a stavon drawn by a bond invisible but unbreakable would come and settle at his feet, not because he was summoned, not because he was commanded, but because he was wanted, and he knew it. Presence over power. There was a profound humility in this relationship. Francis didn't place himself above Esteban. He met him at his level, sometimes literally kneeling down into the grass and dust. The Holy Father of 1.3 billion Catholics, the man whose words could change nations, was kneeling before a limping, dirt-streaked mute who had no name or lineage, at least not yet. In those moments, the world's power structures fell away, leaving only love. Isn't that the central idea of the Christian message? That God, who is infinite and unknowable, chose to dwell among humanity rather than rule it? That redemption was not thundered from the heavens, but whispered through acts of presence, breaking bread, washing feet, and weeping beside graves? Without using words, Pope Francis found a daily reminder of what that looked like in Espan. He had spent his life preaching this radical theology of presence, warning against clericalism and the temptation to lord spiritual authority over others. He had called for a field hospital church that tended wounds instead of building monuments. The dog asked for nothing, did no tricks, and sought no elevation. He merely remained faithful and watchful, giving his entire heart with each silent hour spent under Francis's watchful eye. Later in life, Francis would ask his confidence out loud. Do we confuse love with noise? How frequently do we use great declarations to gauge affection? Costly presents, intricate rituals, but genuine love, the kind that endures, heals, and reverberates forever, can be found in the little unseen deed. A touch, a look. The staff started to notice that Esteban taught that lesson better than any homily during a quiet hour spent sitting side by side with nothing owed or asked. He smiled more easily when Esteban was close by, and the thorns of leadership and the responsibilities of leading a worldwide church through difficult times seemed to temporarily lessen. It was a daily and tangible reminder of what he was fighting for: the simplicity of love, the dignity of every soul, and the conviction that worth is inherent rather than earned. Some people whispered that it was unworthy for the Viceroy of Christ to waste time with a dog, while others were closer to the Pope's heart. He realized that he was unable to turn away because he was the Viceroy of Christ. Christ himself had warned against forgetting the least of us, and he was no more than a beaten street dog that no one had claimed. One evening, as twilight bled over the domes of Rome, a young Swiss guard sat quietly on his bench, watching Francis and Espan from a distance. The Pope's white cassock glowed in the fading light, and Espan, as usual, lay curled at his feet, breathing slowly and steadily, his eyes half closed in complete trust. Brigard went beyond words, later recording in his journal, "In a city of thrones and crowns of power, clothed in gold and tradition steeped in centuries, the greatest majesty I witnessed was not in ceremonies or processions. It was in the silent companionship between an old man and a wounded dog, an image of the gospel too pure for words, presence over power." In Espan's slow, halting trust, Francis frequently stated that the Church's role was to walk with people where they are, rather than to dominate them and drag them where we believe they should be. He saw a parable that showed that love cannot be forced or ordered, rather it must be earned. Constancy built not on rules but relationship. God too waits for us like that, not forcing, not commanding, simply being there, always there. Always love. The Pope's bond with Espan would not end at death's door, but we are getting ahead of ourselves for now. Know this, in every silent hour spent together in that secret garden, a deeper lesson was unfolding, not just for Francis or for Esteban, but for all of us who would later hear their story and feel something shift inside us, a hunger for that kind of love, that kind of presence, that kind of faithfulness. It was the love that looks beyond wounds and fears and sees not what a creature has done, but what they are, beloved. And it all began not with a command, but with a simple act of staying in the silent companionship between Pope Francis and Esteban. Something larger than personal affection unfolded. Their bond was not confined to sentimentality. It opened a doorway into one of the most ancient truths of Scripture, the reverence for all creation as a reflection of God's own heart. When Francis looked into Esteban's scarred face, he didn't just see a dog. He saw creation. He saw Genesis whispered into the rough fur and trembling. It was never just about Esteban. It was also about how God's fingerprints remain on everything he has made sacred, including the stray dog, the battered refugee, and the silent tree that stretches toward the sun. He saw what many people miss. Life itself in all its forms is sacred because it breathes by the will of the Creator. The Pope's fondness for Esteban stemmed from this theology, which is older than any cathedral and deeper than any doctrine. It was the theology of Eden, in which God placed man in the Garden of Eden to tend to and preserve it, not as a duty, but as an extension of love. In Genesis 2:15, Francis recalled this primordial call in Esteban's quiet presence. The scriptures are replete with this same gentle thread, from Noah tending to the animals on the ark, to Jesus using the field and the birds of the air to instill trust in God's provision. Time and again, we are shown that creation is not disposable, not beneath our notice, but is bound up in the very story of redemption. Not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is disregarded in God's sight. Luke 12:6. When Francis knelt next to Esteban on those warm Roman days, he was practicing that remembrance, honoring it, and living it. By doing so, he challenged all of us who hurry past the wounded things of this world, the stray animal included. Francis did not forget a single living thing, the lonely individual thinking they are unimportant, and the dying tree. His connection with Esteban served as a subliminal reminder to us that nothing that God has created is unimportant, even the dog and the gospel. The Pope and Esteban's relationship did more than just show how kind a man was. It was a living example of the gospel. Esteban was useless in every way. He had no part in ceremonies and did not improve the Vatican's reputation. In fact, some people saw him as a distraction, a shabby outsider who had no place among the marble and silk. But Francis understood that whatever you did for one of my least beloved brothers and sisters, you did for me. Matthew 25:40. The gospel has always placed the highest value on love, especially love given where it is least anticipated and least returned, like when Francis bent down to feed a stray. Rather than prestige, he wasn't merely exhibiting altruism when he welcomed a creature that the world had cast aside. Rather, he was announcing the establishment of a kingdom where the lamb and the lion coexist, where no sparrow goes unnoticed, and where love transcends all species, borders, and bloodlines, recognizing only the divine imprint in every living being that serves as a steward rather than an owner. Francis's love for Esteban also reflected a deeper truth about humanity's place in the world, which the Pope would frequently reiterate in his writings, particularly in Laudato Si', his encyclical on the care for our common home creation. He taught that our dominion over the earth, if it means anything at all, must be modeled after God's dominion, which is gentle, selfless, and patient. Francis once wrote, "Each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous." The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. He discovered a daily reminder of this sacred ecosystem in Esteban, which encompasses both environmental and relational management. Every day, there is a cry to respect life in its most vulnerable forms, to slow down to notice, to kneel to love, beyond utility to love, because God first loved us and continues to love extravagantly, wastefully, and beautifully, in every wag of a tail, every blade of grass, and every struggling breath of a creature that did not choose to exist, but exists nonetheless by sheer gift. Love that remembers. Esteban's health deteriorated. Esteban's silent loyalty remained. He didn't understand power structures, titles, or ecclesiastical debates, but he knew and recognized love, and he responded to it in the only way creation can, by being fully present. Perhaps this was the last lesson Francis wanted to leave behind in a world obsessed with acquiring love. Real love remembers. The lowly love kneels before, the scarred love embraces. The simple love stays in Esteban's rough fur and weary eye. When Francis witnessed the latter chapters of his life, he saw not a dog, but a piece of God's love, a heart that spills out into every living thing and declares it beautiful because it is too wild, giving, and full to be restricted to humanity alone. Were written, it would not be golden crowns or marble statues that told the true story of Pope Francis's heart. It would be the small, almost forgotten moments, a hand outstretched, a piece of bread, broken and shared, a dog who was seen and loved. And it is through such moments that the kingdom comes, quietly, faithfully, eternally. Long before Esteban found his way into Pope Francis's life, the Vatican gardens had been a place of quiet escape, a rare corner of the Holy See where marble gave way to moss and ceremony surrendered to silence. It was among the olive trees, older than many nations, where Francis would often walk alone. Here he was not a pontiff carrying the weight of a billion souls, but a simple man searching for the quiet whisper of God in the rustle of the leaves. It was never the grand halls or the solemn chambers where he felt closest to the divine. It was always the places where creation spoke freely, and God's presence felt tangible when Esteban appeared among the twisting garden paths, scared and half-starved. It was no accident in that sacred place, planted by centuries of prayer and reflection, a new story quietly began to. The Bible tells us that God first walked with humans in a garden, in the cool of the day, before shame and fear ever existed. It was a place of unbroken companionship, where man and woman and all creatures lived in the rhythm of divine love. As the garden, which was already sacred in and of itself, unfolded, it became something even more profound. A living echo of Eden, where man and creation met not through dominance, but through trust. Francis, who had longed for a church that recalled this early simplicity, saw something deep in Esteban's eyes without realizing it. They had both returned to a lost way of being through quiet belonging rather than authority. Their relationship was never predicated on orders or expectations. Esteban arrived when he wanted to and stayed because he chose to. In doing so, he taught a lesson older than any sermon. Love cannot be ordered. It must be freely given. In every quiet afternoon spent with him under the olive trees, Francis never treated Esteban like a possession or a project. There were no leashes or coerced gestures. Pope Francis acted out a scene with us. People frequently forget that a garden is a place to be, not a place to rule, and that the purest form of love is to be with someone quietly and consistently. Throughout Scripture, gardens have been revered locations where some of the most significant events in the history of salvation occurred. The Vatican gardens, though tendered by human hands, carried that same sacred power. As Francis's body grew weaker and his steps slowed, the garden transformed from a private retreat to the threshold between heaven and earth, where the eternal brushed against the mortal with every rustle of the olive branches. As Esteban lay beneath the Pope's bench, Francis prayed or simply sat in reflection, and they wove together in a quiet sacrament of companionship. No grand speeches were required, no titles mattered. Only presence did in this daily ritual. The bond between them quietly mirrored God's dream for humanity, that we walk together without fear, without shame, without fear, and without the endless striving for status. Their companionship became a mirror for the church itself. It showed that leadership is not about commanding from above, but about sitting beside it, reminded anyone who cared to see that the church is at its most faithful, not when it builds walls, but when it sits in gardens. When it opens its arms to the lost, the lonely, the overlooked. It was not through grand decrees or theological debates that Francis preached his most powerful message. It was through a simple act, sitting quietly with a stray who had no power, no fame, and no ambition, only loyalty. In those final months, the garden became even more sacred to Francis, even when walking became painful. Even when the weight of illness pressed heavily upon him, he still asked to be taken there. He still sought the shade of the trees, the company of the silent companion who had never left him in those moments, as the world outside rushed with preparations for a new era. Inside the garden, time slowed. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shared glance between an aging pope and a battered stray whispered of Eden. When Pope Francis finally made his quiet request to have Esbon brought to his side in his final hours, no one who understood their bond was surprised in asking for Esbon. Francis was not just asking for comfort, he was asking to return one last time to that sacred place of pure presence, where love is given without expectation and received without pride. He was asking in his final act to show the world what he had always believed, that the most divine things are not found in crowns or cathedrals, but in the simple companionship of those who love, without demanding anything in return. In the quiet breathing of a man and a dog, side by side under the olive trees, the dream of Eden flickered back into life. And for a moment, the world was made right again as the final days of Pope Francis's life drew near. The Vatican itself seemed to slow with him. The corridors that once bustled with movement grew quieter. Conversations hushed into murmurs. Even the air, heavy with the weight of coming sorrow, seemed to thicken amid all this. Esbon remained the faithful dog who had once wandered alone through the city, now refused to leave the sight of the man who had seen worth in him when no one else had. Without understanding the procedures of the church, without being aware of the complex web of tradition around him, or the significance of papal succession, Esteban lived out a gospel truth that was older and far more profound than any rulebook could contain. The power of presence. He did not leave when the air became heavy with grief. He did not shy away when the body he loved became frail and unfamiliar. He stayed when the prayers became more urgent. He stayed when the rooms filled with whispered goodbyes, and he stayed when the world turned its eyes to the future. In this way, he revealed something about the nature of true love, a love that reflects the gospel itself throughout Scripture. The call to faithfulness resounds like a steady drumbeat. It is not the faithfulness of fanfare or achievement, but the kind that endures quietly through pain, loss, and uncertainty. "Stay up with me," Jesus begged in the Garden of Gethsemane, as his own disciples dozed off during his suffering. Humanity is so quick to pledge loyalty when things are simple, but it is difficult to stick with it. Here in the shadowed halls of the Vatican, a creature without words lived out that call more perfectly than many could have imagined. To stay, simply stay, even when the world falls apart. During his pontificate, Francis preached about a church that serves rather than rules, that embraces the wounded instead of condemning them. In Esbon's silent vigil, where vision took on flesh, there were no crowds cheering or cameras recording the moment, just an elderly man getting ready to die, and the creature who would not abandon him in his suffering. It was during these last days that the gospel of presence, which is so frequently overshadowed by arguments over doctrine and power, shone most clearly. Jesus' selfless act of washing his friends' feet was not about grandeur. Rather, it was about lowering oneself to the level of those in pain and being willing to share in their suffering without seeking solace or a way out without being noticed. Francis knew this in his bones. and Esteban brilliantly embodied it by resting his head upon the Pope's quivering fingers. The globe frequently searches for heroes in the strong. The triumphant are praised, but the gospel presents a different picture. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek in the soft padding of Esteban's steps down the Vatican halls in his steadfast presence beside the dying Pope. The Beatitudes came to life not in grand words, but in the simplest of actions: stay, remain, love. It was not just loyalty that Esteban showed, it was forgiveness too. Animals forgive in a way humans often struggle to understand. Esteban, who had known hunger, fear, and abandonment, did not let his past define his love. He did not ask Francis why life had been so hard before he was found. He did not carry bitterness or suspicion when he was called. He came when he was loved. He loved back without condition, without limits. It is the same forgiveness the gospel demands of us, to let go of anger, to trust again, to love as we have been loved. In those final days, as Francis's breath grew shallower and his voice fainter, Esteban's patience became its own kind of sacrament. He asked for nothing. He offered everything. In the eyes of a world obsessed with doing, with achieving, such presence might. As Francis neared the end of his life, he would occasionally whisper words too soft for anyone other than Esteban to hear, blessings, prayers, and fragments of memory. But through it all, Esteban remained a silent testament to the gospel's deepest call to love and to stay, even when there is no triumph, no applause, only the quiet, holy work of being faithful to the end. In the last quiet days of Pope Francis's life, as Esteban remained curled at his side, something profound was happening. Not just a farewell between a man and his faithful companion, but a final living testament to a message he had spent his life preaching through his quiet, unwavering love for Esteban. Francis reminded everyone of a fact he had expressed in sermons, encyclicals, and hushed prayers. It was never enough for Francis to understand that the sacred calling of humanity is to love not only one another, but all of creation, including all creatures, no matter how small, and every area of the planet assigned to our care. In Laudato Si, the world-shaking encyclical, Francis wrote of creation not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred family to be loved and protected. He had made it clear that the Church's mission was tied to both human souls and the earth itself. Simply put, he lived stewardship from his earliest days, adopting the name Francis after the saint who preached to birds and made friends with wolves. In Esteban's presence, by the Pope's bedside, was a living reminder that truth was no longer an idea, but rather a living reminder that here was a creature most would have overlooked, a stray once cast aside by society, now honored in the final hours of one of the most powerful men on earth. The forests, oceans, skies, and animals were not background scenery for humanity's story. Rather, they were beloved works of God's hand, crying out with their own kind of praise, and too frequently their own kind of suffering. It was an insight into the core of the gospel and a representation of the initial balance that God had planned for Eden, where humans and animals coexisted in harmony rather than dominance. Francis had forewarned the world the numerous times. When we forget how to love creation, when we exploit the earth and discard its creatures, we are not merely committing environmental harm, we are committing a spiritual betrayal. According to Paul's letter to the Romans, creation itself moans while it waits to be saved. In his last moments, Francis did not gather kings or cardinals around his bed, nor did he demand grand declarations or final speeches, but instead asked for Esteban, the creature who had taught him, possibly better than any counsel or document ever could, what it means to be present, what it means to be faithful, and what it means to honor life with tenderness and humility. Every fallen tree, every polluted river, and every abandoned animal are wounds in the body of God's world, a cry for humanity to remember its role, not as masters, but as stewards and caretakers who love what God loves. Francis restated his convictions that genuine grandeur is found in defending the little, that tenderness is the foundation of true leadership, and that genuine faithfulness is determined by the depth of one's love for the forgotten, rather than by the size of one's audience. Foreigners of the world of creation. The world watched headlines about a pope passing away quietly with a dog by his side, while others saw a touching story or a heartfelt footnote. However, those who paid close attention heard a final sermon that was delivered not in words but in witness love, protecting, cherishing, and honoring everything that God has made, not because it is useful or serves us, but because the same Creator who gave us life loves it. Between the Church's traditions and the urgent cries of a suffering world, Francis's life served as a bridge connecting the old and the modern. After his death, he constructed a new bridge connecting mankind and the rest of creation, a reminder that in God's kingdom, no act of love or creature loved is ever too small to matter. With his weary body and unwavering heart, Esteban transformed from a dog lamenting his master into a representation of all creation, longing for the day when love will ultimately mend every broken thing. Francis's legacy lived and breathed in the devotion of a stray, the rustle of olive branches, and the gentle silence of a person. It was not merely inscribed in statements or carved into buildings, Vatican garden, where heaven seemed to brush the earth, and a dying man's last act of love whispered more powerfully than any final words ever could in the silent corridors of the Vatican, where words had long filled the halls with proclamations, sermons, and rituals. It was not a grand speech that moved hearts after Pope Francis's death. It was the quiet, steady presence of a small dog, Esteban, without titles, without speeches, without any awareness of the world's gaze, had become a living embodiment of something Christians often speak of, but so rarely live out. The gospel preached not through words, but through presence, loyalty, and humble love. Throughout Scripture, we are reminded again and again that faith is not proven through eloquence or ceremony, but through action. James wrote that faith without works is dead, and Jesus himself said that the world would know his followers by their love. Esteban needed no pulpit, no cathedral, no theological argument. In simply staying beside the Pope in health, in frailty, and finally in death, he preached a deeper kind of sermon, one woven not with sound but with the kind of steadfastness that only true,